All right, here we go. Good evening, everyone. We're glad to have you here for our 4th installment of our teaching series. So welcome back to everyone who's joined us before, and welcome to any new attendees. Before I turn it over to Talia, just a quick reminder, the session is being recorded. A link of the recording will be shared on our websites, both GCEP and Grand Canyon Trust. The session will also be streamed on Facebook Live, so if you'd like to share it with folks who you think might be interested, who maybe didn't get a chance to register, you can go check it out on our event page on Facebook. You're on mute and we can't see you, so don't worry about any background noise. Feel free to move around as you need to. And you can submit any questions using the Q&A function throughout this session, which we will be circling back to audience questions in our final teach-in next week. Also, if you have any technical issues, you can drop questions in there and I'll help you out. If you're here today, you're already registered for our last session, so you'll be able to use that same link. And if you're viewing the recording and want to register for our session next week, you can do so with the link that is shown on the screen. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Talia.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Relatives, thank you for everyone for joining us this evening. Before we get started, I would like all of us to take a moment to recognize wherever we may be tuning in from that we are all on native land. And I will go ahead and introduce myself in Diné. She'e Talia Boyd and she Todich Eatney and Shle Toa Haglini Bashis Chin Ash Deshachedo Tobahan Deshanale Not Georgia Ashahawan had Audinesta. Thank you, everybody. This evening, unfortunately, Kathy Sanchez, our elder, was unable to join us, and so we invited Beata Tsosie-Peña to be a part of the dialogue. Thank you, Beata, for joining us this evening. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and I'll start with Beata. Beata Tsosie-Peña is from Santa Clara Pueblo and El Rito, New Mexico. She is a mother, poet, seed keeper, and is certified in infant massage as a developmental specialist, an educator, a full spectrum doula, and breastfeeding support counselor, and in Indigenous sustainable design, permaculture. She is currently on the steering committee for the Traditional Institute Board of Directors. She is also serving on the New Mexico Governor's Task Force on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women as a Pueblo representative. The realities of living next to the nuclear weapons complex has called her into environmental health and justice work with the nonprofit organization Tewa Women United for over a decade. As part of her work with Tewa Women United, she is currently managing the creation of the Espanola Healing Foods Oasis Demonstration Garden Project and Espanola's Healing Foods Seed Library. Welcome, Beata.
Thank you.
Next, we have Roberto Nutlouis, who is Diné from Piñon Navajo Nation. He is Twitich Eatney, Bitterwater Clan, born for Twitswitney, Bigwater Clan. Nutlouis has been actively involved in the sustainable evolution of Black Mesa and the Navajo Nation for several years. His experience and expertise includes work in environmental justice, food security, energy efficiency, housing, and youth leadership development. In his spare time, he likes to work on food security issues and traditional knowledge in agriculture with Native youth. And he enjoys hiking, river rafting, camping, and reading. Thank you for joining us, Roberto. Next, we have Adesbah Foguth, who is also Diné. She is from the Toaheglini Water Flows Together clan and the Tachitni clan, red flows into the water. Adesbah holds a BA in English and Philosophy and a Master's in Public Archaeology from the University of New Mexico. She has worked as a public school teacher in the Navajo Nation as an archaeologist in northern New Mexico and is currently a federal park ranger for the Bureau of Land Management. Adesbah is a creator of the Native Power Rangers Instagram page, an educational page dedicated to decolonizing federal parks and public lands, highlighting Indigenous park rangers, and enhancing awareness and understanding of Indigenous history, culture, and knowledge systems. Thank you for joining us, Adesbah. And real quickly, before we jump into our questions and dialogue, I just want to share real quickly, as we may all be aware, that federal public lands are continually plagued with a wide range of problems, from mining activities to questionable land exchanges to invasions of exotic animal and plant species. Native communities have been inundated by extractive industries, belligerent looting and vandalism, and reckless recreation. We are often on the front lines of defending our territories, our sacred landscapes, our resources, and our rights from extractive projects and corporate and outside interests. This evening, we will be discussing how to visit with respect on ancestral land and the importance of grassroots organizing. So let us go ahead and begin with our dialogue. And just to kick us all off, panelists, this question is for all of you, so feel free to answer. What does it mean to visit with respect, and what does that look like for you personally? And you know what, I'll go ahead and I'll ask Beata to kick us off.
Okay, Kundawaha. Thank you. I think personally, for myself, I've been fortunate to be mentored in these ways from some elders in my community about, and just observing growing up, how that was done. And I think, like, looking back on how Indigenous nations used to visit other Indigenous nations, you know, and we had that really strong relations with each other throughout time. And I just wanted to share a story about, you know, working with some of my elders that have been doing this work for a long time. And we talked about this of, you know, thinking about ongoing colonial value systems in our communities, and a lot of in response to, you know, identity politics and things like that we're having to navigate, which is part of the larger issue of colonialism. And so we started in our travels of networking and meeting with other people, we started to practice the entryway ceremony, which was a way of traditionally that we would go into other Indigenous territories in a respectful way of really intentional practice. I think that it was a really formal thing when people took the time to visit one another across these vast landscapes and regions. And, you know, that still applies today in a lot of ways. So, for example, we went to a conference out in California, and it was on Ohlone territory. And it was me and Marian Naranjo from Santa Clara and Vicky Downey from Tetsuge. And so when we went, they happened to be, there was a ceremony at Indian Canyon, and we went there and we got, you know, we talked to them about it, and we did it with the people that were there. And it's basically you come in singing so that the people that hear you know that you're coming in a peaceful way. And, you know, you do your cleansing behind you so that you're not bringing any hardship or negative energy into those people's territories. And you come with gifts, and you come with asking of permission to enter. And so having that really clear consent and asking and being prepared to hear yes or no, and honoring that either way. And the conference we went to was actually by some nuns, and you know, they were asking us to do opening for this event, and I was like, and asking these same questions. Well, whose land are you on? You know, what relations do you have with the people there? And they hadn't done that initial work within their own group. So it took me about 5 minutes on Facebook to find someone that lived there in their where they were having the conference. So it's not that hard to reach out and make that initial connection with Indigenous peoples of a place, you know. And a lot of times Indigenous nonprofits and organizations are used as a way to bypass having to make those real relations with Indigenous peoples. And so I just want to caution about doing that also. And so, yeah, I was able to connect with Elder Anne Marie Sayers out in Ohlone. And when we talked to these people at this conference, to these nuns, and we were like, yeah, you know, you have to pray to the ancestors of these places and ask permission when you enter and acknowledge. And the people of the place, and when we were talking to them, they thought we were talking about like spirits, people who had passed on. And when we went out and we sang our song and entered into this redwood clearing, and there was a real elder from the land standing there, you know, they were blown away that it was, and there's still that like erasure of that, like that we're not still here in a lot of circles and spaces. And so really reaching out to the living cultures that still are practicing and still have those real relations. And I do have a statement from Elder Kathy Sanchez, if I have time to read that. Okay. So Saya Kathy, our prayers are with you for your continued healing. And I'm honored to read this statement on your behalf. So this is some words Saya Kathy asked me to share with you from San Ildefonso Pueblo, Pohoge. How should one visit with respect on ancestral lands? From experience and or witnessed, let me start by saying this is what I know from my Native woman perspective as I have dealt with in my life and my lifetime from the many orientations of overlapping lens of introspection, transpections, and as informed by dreaming into the future. All this orients from the interconnectivity of energy. Some call it souls, spirit or light, love or lack of light as darkness, but all have presence in our presence. There are many ways to communicate with many forms or levels of existence in time, in space, and in memory. Distance is not important. This all relates back to the question of how should one visit with respect on ancestral lands? Highlighting the impacts. How does energy of being impacted the coming into this plant world? Through birth, pathway of entry, day of entry, energy of breath, the spark needed to start life, the incubation and womb of women and exist, day of entry with our own first breath, called birthday. How do we celebrate the coming of new life into earth and lands, plant world, animal, human, plant, water, air, fire? How do we exist with or without conscious awareness of the totality of presence of life? How do we move the air with our walk, with our talk, with our eyes? Who guides our energy of negative or positive ways of projection? How does a dog sense presence coming at a distance? Who smells the odor first? Who sends the signal of feeling a presence, sends an alarm signal? How do we enter into lands new to our beingness? We humbly ask permission to enter, to land, to water, to trees, to animals, insects, to human energy, presents other levels of existence unknown to us, energy all around, seen and unseen. Science is now catching up to speed. See it, feel it, smell it, taste it, hear it. Feeling at ease or dis-ease is learned behavior. How do we make others' presence be of mutually assured, hope for unity or agreed values? How do I get to know you in time with no quick judgments, no projection of knowing what is best for you? Personal stories and visiting to other sites known through storytellings of our elders, great-grandparents, elders in community. Once we went to lands where the rivers came together in a valley with singing birds and high cliffs. We sure stopped to offer our cornmeal and thanked the life we encountered upon our entry, letting them know we see them and are happy for them. We sang our entry song. Once the people of this land heard us, they came to greet us. They were crying with joy as this brought back memories of long ago times. We brought gifts to thank them for caring for Mother Earth. Their community and all life creations had their part in their life ways. Problems. Back to knowingness of knowledge, transference of foreign orients, where power over others' energy to give life is stolen for others. Their use without permission of exchange or recognition of what it means to maintain its original purposefulness in a beloved community. Take on paper. Power is given from outside means. The interpretations without consultation is toxic energy. Taking of the light of life, love of humanity without impunity by their own standards of existence. How does a human life live without light from the cosmos? Celestial radiant light of love or life for all. So those are some thoughts from Kathy on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. Yeah, man, Kathy is brilliant, and she has so much to add to this conversation. And so I need to organize another series so we can have Kathy here. Thank you, Beata, for sharing that statement. And thank you, Kathy, for sharing that statement with us as well. Roberto or Adesbah, would you like to add to that?
All right, I'll go ahead and jump in. Yate, and thank you again for organizing this. I was just sitting here thinking about what ancestral lands to me, and then just my own personal journey. You know, I grew up here on the reservation on the Navajo Nation, and you know, we would hear a lot of stories from our elders of the different places that are now outside of the Navajo reservation, which is traditionally our traditional homelands, which a lot of them are now public lands and private lands. But we still hear stories of how our elders and their, you know, the ancestors would go to these places with intention. And that's what they always tell us is like, you just don't go to these places unintentionally. You have to have intentions for it. And there's different preparation, whether if it's hunting, you have to go through a whole ritual. If you're going to go to these places to harvest meat, if you're going to harvest plants, if you're going to put your offerings down. So there's always has to be an intention. Why are you going to those places in the first place? And growing up, we really didn't go to these places because we didn't have the resources. I know now there's a lot of folks that are privileged to visit these places primarily for recreational means, but we didn't come up with that kind of privilege, so we never really went to these places. But we did hear stories growing up, and then again being involved within the grassroots movement, environmental justice movement. We realized that a lot of our homelands were being threatened by development, primarily fossil fuel development in some of our ancestral homelands. And some of the stories that we've heard from elders in those regions tell us about, you know, the desecration that's happening to the petroglyphs and a lot of these sacred sites that are being desecrated. So we've taken the time to learn what is that protocol that we go and visit these places, consulting with our medicine people, and they're the ones that took us out there. What's really important for me in visiting these ancestral homelands is taking our young people. As I mentioned, a lot of our young people live, especially those living on the reservation, are not, you know, privileged to go and visit these amazing, beautiful places that are our homelands. So we've taken some initiative within the last 3 years to make our pilgrimages to our sacred sites, to the sacred mountains, and again there. We did offerings, and you know, you bring your gifts as stated previously, that we came with our gifts, with our corn pollen, with our offering, with the songs, and it was beautiful to have our elders there beside us, kind of guiding us how to talk, you know, how to talk with the elements, to the water, to the mountain, to the animals. We've also done some traditional structures, building these traditional structures on these homelands, ancestral homelands, and we also go to some of these places to harvest some of the logs needed, some of the plants that we utilize. And again, we had elders accompany us, and again they made their prayers and talked to the trees, to the different species of trees, to remind ourselves how they've, you know, put themselves there to say, like at the beginning of time, that we were welcome to utilize these materials to build our homes. They also, the medicine people also talk to the animals and the different species, living beings that depend on these resources too, to ask for forgiveness because we were going to take those materials to build. So I think for me is what is that intention when we go to these places, and to always know that you have to offer something. And in our case, we have the corn pollen, the karadin that we would use. And we were given instruction as to how do we, you know, place our cornmeal, and it's always from four direction, to acknowledge everything from the four direction, all the elements, the life forces that is embodied in that four direction, to Mother Earth and up into the cosmos, and then state your intention. So I think that's really important for me to know that and to learn that, but also to pass that knowledge to our young people. I think that's really critical if we're going to maintain these sacred places, our sacred ecology, that our own people also have to know what are those protocols and how do we approach these spaces in a very respectful and reverence way. So again, we've been fortunate to create to gather the resources and to take young people from our community to these places. And I hope we can continue to do that down the road, because a lot of us are not privileged to visit these, again, beautiful and amazing places and spaces. The other thing too is, and we know that some of these places is shared landscapes with other tribes. So I'm always, personally, I'm always interested, who are the other neighbors that we coexist with and utilize these landscapes, and what is their narrative of this landscape? What is their connection to it? I think that really helps to enrich our understanding of how these landscapes are cherished by different people, different tribes, and have that mutual respect, because we do enter into other territories that are not necessarily within our reservation boundaries, that are still shared landscapes with other tribes within our region. And even just traveling out across the country, I'm always thinking, who were the original people that live in these places, and what are the names of these different landmarks that you see? And that's always really interesting to know, what are the names of those landscapes and the landmarks. And so I think I always try to go with reverence, respect, to give offering, but also to learn what are the other narratives that people have of these places and spaces, to have that much more deeper appreciation for these places, and also to respect other people's views of these places.
Thank you, Roberto. Adesbah, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I want to echo what y'all said just now about making offerings, asking permission, and proceeding, only then proceeding to visit these lands, and you have your intentions and reasons for being there. I think this is true. I think all visitors, whether you're native or non-native, they need to proceed in this way. Because I think when as a native person, when I see that hurts me, is people climbing on the ancient buildings, camping in kivas, and collecting pottery sherds as souvenirs, taking it home, generally just being very disrespectful. This hurts. I mean, it's devastating, because as Indigenous people, we see these places, these sites, these locations, these lands as something sacred to us. So we do offer prayers, and we state our purpose. Here is why we're visiting. And you have to have a good reason. You can't just come because you want to exploit it. You want to climb on it and play around. That is not a good reason, and it's harmful. It's harmful to that site. It's harmful to you. And so I would say that even non-Indigenous people need to approach native lands, which are public lands also, and native ancestral sites and ceremonial sites, like the ones in Bears Ears or places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. They need to approach it with a reverent and prayerful attitude. If you're not a prayerful person, perhaps just reverence and deep respect for it. And myself, I did work at Chaco Canyon last year as a park ranger. And when I found out that I was hired to be a park ranger there, I immediately sat down and said prayers and asked if I could go. And I said, I'm there to learn and I'm there to educate. Is it okay? The answer that I received back was, yes, it's okay. And here's how you proceed. And I was told that I should think about Chaco as something with sentience, as a living thing, that it's autonomous, and that place makes decisions. It has autonomy, it makes decisions. And so when I began to think of Chaco as a place like that, it changed the way I interacted with Chaco. It changed in how I was moving across that landscape. And so I would implore visitors who are not Indigenous to start conceptualizing or thinking about how we move on the land, how we visit these places. And I would say adopt that attitude. Think about these sites as living. Think of them as sentient even. They are not lifeless. They have their own life. And that when we disrespect these sites by climbing on the walls, like I said, camping inside the kivas, removing things from it, digging it, excavating it, taking our ancestors out of there from their graves, is deeply harmful to me and many Indigenous people, but it also harms you as well. And I don't think this is just purely in the realm of Indigenous beliefs. I think it affects everybody. So I would say we all need to adopt this attitude of moving reverently on the land and thinking of these sites as sacred, as important, and as connected to the Native belief systems. So I think I'm sort of reiterating what has already been said, but I just wanted to repeat that again and add that it's for everyone to do this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank all of you. It's all of our responsibilities when we go into these sacred spaces. You know, these sacred spaces are, they're a system. They're all connected. They're all interwoven. As Native peoples, our very identities and lifeways are connected and interwoven with the landscape through our languages and our ceremonies. And absolutely, you know, we have to get consent from other tribal nations when we're going into their territories. And we are still here. So, you know, folks need to understand that these ancestral lands aren't our ancestors. We are here. We are here as Native peoples, and we're going to be here for a long time. This is our land. And then just to reiterate what everybody has been saying too, it really does go back to your energy within and when you go into these spaces, right? Because when you desecrate sacred spaces in that way, even bringing in negative energy, it has a direct impact on that space, but also on the psyche of anybody who is who pays respect to these sacred landscapes. And for Indigenous people, we do that often. And so it has a direct impact on the psyche of all of us when our sacred landscapes are desecrated. You know, when the integrity of these spaces is compromised, then it compromises our abilities to heal ourselves from the land. And so for these reasons, it's very important for all of us to understand that we do have a responsibility to the land, whether you're Native or not. Thank you all for all of that beautiful insight. Let's go ahead and move on to our second question. And Beata, this one is for you. How are issues like missing and murdered Indigenous relatives and environmental justice connected to public lands?
So I'm going to try and compress that. That's a big question. Really, we could talk about that for another hour probably, so I'll do my best. But it comes from you know, the understanding now of Native peoples as a living part of our ecologies, and that any harm that happens to our landscapes, to our air, water, seeds, is happening to us. And so when you look at our earth, what's being done to our earth is being done to Native peoples. And I want to really center Indigenous pregnant women and pregnant people in talking about this issue. And at Tewa Women United, we have a model called Navatoi Gia, which translates from Tewa to land worker mother. Keep in their mind, heart, spirit around when you talk about these issues of environmental justice and land and missing and murdered relatives, and why this is happening at such a pandemic level for Native communities. Because when Indigenous pregnant families are protected, everybody is protected. And what I mean by that is, you know, to give you an example, standards of environmental protections. Right now, where I live, we're dealing with nuclear weapons production in our ancestral homelands with Los Alamos National Laboratories. the current federal standards of determining how much radiation they can expose workers, people to cleanup standards are based off of an adult white male. You know, so that's an example of how we are not centered or protected by current environmental regulations. So any kind of colonial form of governance over our land is going to be a direct attack on our bodies and on our ability to pass on our knowledge, our memories, our traditions in a way of nurturance, in a way that's aligned with thinking for future generations, which is not honored right now by current colonial mindset. You know, so that harm that when colonial mindset was imposed on our peoples, it was a direct assault to disconnect people from the land. And you know, you can't do that. You can attempt it, but you can't, because we are the land. You know, so it's a reflection of this exploitation, and basically extraction industries are often compared and metaphorically compared to rape, you know, because of that lack of consent, because of that taking, just because of the very physical act of drilling, and, you know, the explosions, the militarization of native lands is another example. And it's where I live, you know, we have reservation communities, and we have acequia land grant communities, which were also established. And so dealing with these three waves of colonialism from Spanish, Mexican, and the United States, we've really had to, we have a long struggle ahead of us, you know, and we're still resisting, but it makes it really difficult when our communal land rights have been stripped from certain communities, but then maybe maintained in other communities. So it's a divide and conquer strategy. You know, these checkerboard communities where some people one person can speak for others, you know, and setting up these values that are not ours. So when I hear land back and those movements, the first thought that comes is give us back our national forests, give us back our BLM lands, give us back our BIE managed places, you know, because they're being mismanaged, they're being exploited, and they're setting up our peoples for further harm. You know, it's common knowledge now that extraction industries increase rates of violence in Native communities through man camps, through demand in, you know, drugs and human trafficking. And that's, you know, that's becoming a pandemic in itself. And so there's a lot of preventative measures that we can enact as sovereign peoples, as Native peoples, to where we know that it's a matter of life and death for our communities, that we are in charge of these places, that we are giving care to these places in the way that only we know how, through these spiritual, physical, cultural life ways that are very much still alive, you know, and not a thing of the past. And, you know, Dr. Greg Cajete from my pueblo, he talks about Indigenous peoples as an indicator species for the health of their environment. And so if you look at Indigenous communities and how healthy they are, you can usually gauge the surrounding health of the environment. Because if the people have been forcefully removed or disconnected from those environments, then their health is going to suffer, and the environmental health around those communities are also going to suffer, because there's not that ecological balance and exchange happening anymore. We're not at the level that it was before we had full access to our traditional lands. So I hope that touched on it a little bit.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's an important issue. I think a lot of times, you know, because our public lands are being inundated by a lot of mining and extractive industries. And it is true that these industries do bring in a lot of outside folks who aren't from these communities, who do create man camps, and then the violence rises in our communities. So these are real issues that we're talking about, and very real within Indian country. So let's go ahead and move on to the next question. And this one is for Roberto. How does Native grassroots community organizing support tribal preservation and the management of ancestral land? And you kind of touched on it earlier with your organizing and taking youth out into these sacred landscapes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, I think grassroots organizing is really important, not just for Native communities, but all communities to be politically engaged in some of the decision-making processes of various governments, whether it's tribal, state, or federal government. I think is really important, and that's where it's the community organizing really helps to lift the political power of the people. So I think that's really important. And tribal governments can only do so much. And in our experience, they often, at least for the Navajo Nation, they often go against these very same indigenous values that we have to say that these lands are sacred and that they're not there to be exploited. Unfortunately, sometimes tribal governments do. So that's where the voice of the people is very critical, especially grassroots organizations, to confront these unjust decision-making processes, and also some of the laws that were created that allows for these exploitations to even happen. So I think the grassroots voice is very critical to uplift the injustices that have been happening, as it was stated, from colonization to now, it continues to happen. The voice of the people, I think, is best heard and best vocalized from grassroots organization. And in that, I think there's a lot of innovation and collaboration that could emerge that I feel like tribal governments cannot really do. Like for the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, they were very successful in bringing together different tribal representative, and really, I think this is the first public lands that was set aside with tribal input. A lot of the other public lands around our communities, around the reservations, were taken, for our people, taken illegally. A lot of our people were forced out of these forest lands and out of these BLM lands without their consent. So there's still this injustice, even just with the existing public lands they've done, just for them to exist as they are today. Our ancestors and our elders paid a lot of price for that. But as we move forward, I think what the Bears Ears Coalition has done really gives, the Intertribal Coalition really gives a way that tribes can work together as grassroots organization and really make a difference in land management up at the federal level. Beyond land management, again, I think is really important to bring young people to these places. Why do we say it's sacred? Why is it, what does it mean to us? And a lot of our elders and our spiritual leaders, they're very concerned about the loss of language and the loss of knowledge of these places, and even just the outright desecration. A lot of these petroglyphs that our medicine people go to, they're just not petroglyphs. These are places of embedded energy that our people understood. That's that deep, intimate knowledge that they have to these landscapes. So they go there with, at least for our people, go there with their medicine bundle to recharge these paraphernalia so that they can bring that energy home to conduct these ceremonies for people out here. And so these places and these spaces have to remain in the best way, in their pristine way, so that those energy, the good healing energy, could be brought back to the people. But once the desecration happens, again, it does have an impact, not only for the current generation, but future generation. So I think that kind of knowledge, a lot of our medicine people don't really want to share that knowledge because, again, if they open it up, it's going to create more desecration. So we're kind of navigating, how do we do it in a way that allows our people to have a better, deeper understanding, especially our young people, to these places, especially places that we've been kicked out. We were able to partner with some young people a couple of years back to build our traditional male hogan at the base of Cisnachin, our eastern sacred mountain by Alamosa, Colorado. Our people haven't been, these kind of structures haven't been built since Kit Carson came up there in the late 1800s and drove our people out of that region. We don't, like, people don't tell us that we used to live way up there, up in Alamosa, Colorado, in those regions. But our people did, but we were chased out of that. So we were able to come back, work with private landowners, or work with different youth groups, and we built a traditional Earth Lodge, the male Hogan up there. And now we reclaim that space so that we can continue to go and make our offering. So I think those kind of creativity and innovation that grassroots organizations and community groups can bring to the land management, and how do we manage this, and how do we evolve ourselves to this and take up that task. I think that there's a lot of possibilities that I feel like tribal governments don't really have that ability to do that. So, and again, as our lands are continuing to be targeted by different extreme energy development, this voice has to continuously be there. And not just only tribal voices. I know a lot of groups like the Neck Hair and other groups have, joined alliances with other environmental groups to really try to protect some of our sacred sites for numbers of years, and really try to bring that information back to the communities out here, because we don't really hear what's happening outside of grassroots voices. So I think that's really important that grassroots are out there and informing the community what's happening and what action they can take, or what action is being taken to protect and to preserve. And also to open up some of these spaces. Some of them we're not even allowed to go and harvest some of our traditional whether it's foods or whether it's woods or whatever, we're still restricted to hunt, or even to hunt on some of these places. So I think there's still a lot more conversation that is needed with the different government agencies, so that we can participate, or we can be a part of, and we can help bring back that Indigenous land stewardship back to these places and allow our people to come back. So we do what we can in our own capacity. And again, I think our focus is like, how can we bring our young people to these places and let them have a deeper awareness and appreciation for our landscape, so that they too can share that with their families and friends of these places, these beautiful places. And there's just so much. I haven't explored all of it, but I know there's just so much beautiful places out there to learn about and to reconnect with. And I think that's where the grassroots voice is very critical to allow that.
Absolutely. It does require people power when it comes to land protection. And you're right, our tribes don't have the resources or capacities to get out there and protect our ancestral homelands a lot of times. And so it does require our people to do that work. And it is important to have that transmission of traditional knowledge between our generations and going down to the young people, because they are going to be the next stewards of the land. So absolutely, grassroots organizing is definitely critical to all of this. So thank you, Roberto, for sharing that. I want to go ahead and jump over to Adesbah. This question is for you. In what ways can we decolonize or re-indigenize how we talk and think about public lands?
Yes, I think my journey down this path of looking at words and language really started when I would walk into museums and read things on the museum wall that said, Native Americans went through a time of great change, when they were really talking about colonization and genocide and an era of forced removal and assimilation policies, right? And my reaction to that was visceral. I mean, it was a physical reaction, and I felt very strongly that this was not right. My heart rate increased, my blood pressure started going, and I started to think, why am I so bothered by this language? And then I'd go down to the trail, and the trailhead would say something like, about the history of a historic site or an ancestral Pueblo site. And it would say, call the time that Europeans came to America as a period of contact. And I was thinking do they mean European invasion? So I started to think like, why do these words bother me so much? And so I began to investigate like what these words mean from the Western's perspective, and how, and this is the important part, how it negatively impacts Indigenous communities in the real world. And so to answer this question, how do we talk about and think about public lands and Native American ancestral sites? I think the ways that we talk about these places and think about them directly inform how we act on the land, how we treat these sacred sites and ancient structures. So take, for example, a word that are two words that really bother me as well, abandoned and ruin. So oftentimes Chaco, for example, is described as an abandoned ruin. The Native Americans abandon it and it's left in ruins. I mean, sure, it looks that way, but think for a moment in your mind, what do you see when I say abandoned and I say ruin? So you're conceptualizing that word now. What images come to your mind? When I do that from this Western sort of perspective, I see an empty, lifeless place that someone has left and doesn't care about. It's lifeless, and someone has left it alone. They're never coming back. That's what abandoned means. Ruin, it's uncared for. And when we apply these words to places like Chaco, what are the consequences of that? And again, this really makes me really emotional because I'm devastated to see those consequences played out on our landscapes. Because I brought up Chaco, what happened to Chaco in the late 1800s? Along comes Richard Weatherhill, the famed explorer / discoverer of our ancestors and ancestral sites. He excavates it with a team of people. And I think the reason why these places were excavated without our permission is because they thought of these places as abandoned, uncared for, lifeless objects. And so when I hear words like that, it makes me cringe because I know how people are visiting these places now. I know how they think about them. And I know that it's a way to excuse what they're going to do or have done to those places. Because let's go back in history. Did anyone ask the Pueblo people or Navajo people or Hopi people if it was okay to excavate Chaco and remove the ancestors and turn it into a tourist destination? Nobody asked. Had they asked, their answer would have been, leave it alone. The reason why it looks abandoned to you, that it looks uncared for, that it's filled with sand, is because we intentionally left it that way. It's a way of respect. We don't bother those things because we consider them as a living place, as a place that's still occupied by the spirits of our ancestors. It's the final resting place of many of our ancestors. And it is a sacred site. How dare us, if we wanted to dig it up and remove its contents, and even worse, more egregious, to display our ancestors in museums and experiment on them, which is still happening. Our ancestors are still being experimented upon. And these archaeological papers, scientific papers, are being published all the time. And they're being published unapologetically. So again, when I hear the word abandon or hear the word ruin, it brings up very intense emotions for me because I know what the effects of those words are on my culture and my heritage and my indigenous lifeways. And it's devastating, honestly. What's been done has been done, however. Chaco is a tourist destination. It is, Pueblo Benito has been fully excavated. And that happened in the 1920s when it was finished. They did not bury a big portion of it. You can walk inside the ruins. I think I think the Western world thinks they're preserving that place, but really the way to preserve places is to leave it alone altogether. Don't go in them. If you asked a Dene person, I'm Dene, if you asked a Dene person, how should we visit with respect? They would say, don't even go into those places at all. That's the ultimate sign of respect. Maybe peek in it, keep a distance from it, but don't even go in at all. Definitely don't excavate it. So I think words have meaning, and words have meaning because the way we talk about something is the way we think about something. The way we think about it directly informs our actions and the way we make decisions about those places. And I have a whole list of words like this from the English language that does harm it harms and does irreparable damage to Native communities and Native lands and Native sacred sites. Words like contact, prehistory, pre-Columbian, pre-Hispanic, words like Anasazi, Chacoan. These words are endless, you know, and I hope to bring more awareness to how we use our words when discussing places that are important and sacred to Native Americans, because I hope that it will change our attitudes and more importantly, change the way we interact and engage with these places. So again, I think your question, or the question of this discussion is here, how do we visit with respect? I think visiting with respect first means reconceptualize how we think about Native American lands and Native American cultural sites, culturally significant sites and sacred sites. Think of it as living. Think of it as something that not only, that is not just merely lifeless. And I think that's what's so sad to me. I think people think these places are objects to play on. If we stop thinking of it that way, perhaps we can preserve it in that sense. That's true preservation. Don't touch it. See it from a distance. Learn from it. Enjoy it. But don't destroy it by climbing on it, walking through the walls, you know. I mean, this is all things I've seen at Chaco. I mean, it makes me so sad. But to answer your question, let's think of these places as a living space. And in that way, we can have respect for it.
Thank you, Adesbah. That was powerful and on point. These are hard issues for us Native folks to talk about, and it is very, very much emotional. These are our traditional homelands. We have deep, deep connections to these lands, and anything that happens to the land happens to us. We hurt inside when anything is done to it. And I think that's what a lot of our non-Native relatives don't really understand, is that, and like Beata said earlier, what you do to the land, you do to us as Native peoples, because we are so integrated with it in that way. Yes, pay reverence. And if anything, if you want to show respect, just leave it alone. That's the easiest way to show your respect for these places. Thank you, Adesbah. So let's go ahead and switch over to this question real quick. How does food sovereignty support land protection and tribal preservation? And I'm going to shoot that out to all of you. But let's go ahead and start with Roberto. Roberto, can you kick us off on that question there? Thank you.
Sorry about that, I'm mute. I really jumped into it and it's all mute. Yeah, so a lot of these places, these public lands are places that, like I mentioned, our ancestors and our elders have gone to go hunting. Some of these are our hunting grounds. And when I say hunting, this is not recreational hunting. We use the deer hides and the different animals that our people harvest for ceremonial use too. So it's also food and medicine and for ceremonial purposes. You know, right now we have piña. There's a piña crop happening all over the Southwest. So a lot of our people are traveling to these places to pick piñas. You know, there's certain times of the seasons that there's berries and other things that are ready to be harvested. So, you know, it's those are the foods that we, especially within the food sovereignty movement, you know, we've been conditioned to, you know, look at the commercialized food system, and now we're learning how this commercial food system is really detrimental to our body, and so there's a big you know movement to really re-educate our people about, you know, why it's important to eat traditional foods, and especially wild or these foods that grow out there, out on the landscape. So I think as more and more of this awareness and this, or people reconnect to these foods, I think it's really important that we have access to these public lands again to collect and harvest our foods. And, you know, our people know how to collect these things in a very regenerative, sustainable ways. We have different ways, you know, we have different teachings of how we collect and how we put forth offering, and who are the deities and the animals that showed us how to collect these. Again, like the bears and the lions and all of these different beings that live out there, they are our elders, and they're the ones that taught us the different uses of these landscapes and the different foods that are edible and how to and when to harvest them. So there's a whole connection to those ecosystems that we, where the knowledge comes from, again, from these beings. So I think it's really important for us to visit these places, to reacquaint ourselves to these places, and to begin to eat off of the land the way that our ancestors did. I think that's really critical for the healing of our people, especially with this, you know, we have the diabetes, obesity epidemic that's happening on our reservation with our people because we're not eating the proper foods again. So that's really important. The other piece to it is a lot of these landscapes, especially within the narrative, the food narratives that we have, a lot of these places is where a lot of our foods originally came from. So I think that narrative is really important for our people to know. Where did corn come from? Where did beans come from? Where did the squash come from? And then again, a lot of that narrative is, our people, you know, we're taught that we didn't have a writing system, but then we have a lot of these petroglyphs all over our landscape, where a lot of our story is embedded in these petroglyphs. And, you know, our elders like James or Filmer Bluehouse, you know, showed us some of these petroglyphs, some of the symbolism, what they mean, what narratives. We have a lot of stories, creation stories that are tied to these petroglyphs. So again, that's the same thing with our food systems. A lot of the knowledge within our food system really comes from these landscapes, from the bighorn sheep, from the bears, from the mountain lion, from the porcupines. So I think we have to learn how to read the landscape again, the way our ancestors did and what they wrote on there. And I think there's a lot of knowledge that could be relearned and regained and share with people. I think that's really, really important. So I think part of that is really being able to work with the different government agencies, whether it's BLM, the U.S. Forest Service, these things with these agencies to allow our people to have access to these lands and to be able to eat the foods from these lands again as part of food sovereignty and having access to healthy foods. So I think that's really important. That's probably something that's really unique within the food sovereignty movement, because food access is always an issue, not just for Native people, but other people of color. But for us, food access isn't just going to the grocery stores or going to an organic grocery stores, natural food stores. It's actually going onto the landscape and harvesting these foods again. And a lot of them are also medicine, different herbs and different roots that are used for medicine. So I think that's really important. And part of that, again, is engaging in the public policy and the decision-making process, and to be able to negotiate these things with the different government agencies that oversee these landscapes, the public lands.
Thank you, Roberto. We have about 2 minutes left. Do you want to add anything real quick, Beata?
Sure, I would add that, of course, we need a clean environment to have healthy food systems. We know that our traditional food systems span all of our ancestral lands and territories, not just limited to reservations. So these borders are meaningless when it comes to Indigenous ways of knowing. And that also includes our relations with Southern Indigenous relatives. You know, for example, at the Healing Foods Oasis, we're having annual workshops on our traditional grain of amaranth, you know, with our Guatemalan farmer family from the South. And so we still have these living relations, even with Southern Indigenous peoples, of sharing food and seeds and knowledge and being in ceremony together. And so this militarization of our borders is a direct threat to our food systems. and that sustainability of that ability to share food and seeds with each other. I would also add that I don't think we can appeal to government entities in a way that is like when their first method of colonization was an attack on our food systems. And we're still recovering from that to this day, where our food systems were systematically destroyed. So to weaken us, to then steal our lands. And we're still reeling from that, you know? So it is very much a balance of, yes, we have our irrigation farming, which we've always done, but we also did balance that with these wild foods and nurturing these spaces like Robert was talking about. And we need to maintain that. We need to reconnect even with this way of preparing these foods and using these plant teachings from our plant elders again. Remembering that order of our cosmology, that these plants and animals and insects are our elders, they're our teachers. They preceded humans, they preceded man-made law, and that's why we thank them. Before we pray for ourselves, we pray for those things because they came before us, you know. And so those are, when I talk about Indigenous people, I am also talking about them as that they're Indigenous to this place too, and they're not at the table. And we need to bring that into these conversations as well, as because they don't honor borders. Water and the earth do not have any understanding of borders and what that, and watersheds, you know. So what can be happening in one community might impact a watershed in another community, and how that impacts food systems as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, panelists. We are at the top of the hour, so we are going to go ahead and end our session here shortly. But before we do that, I'd like to read a quote real quick. When the blood in our veins returns to the sea and the earth in your bones returns to the ground, perhaps then you will remember that this land does not belong to you. It is us who belongs to the land. This is an unknown author. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, panelists, for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and your expertise, and all of your heartfelt insights. Thank you. Please join us again next Thursday for our final panel of this teaching series. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a great night, and we will see you next Thursday.